I was watching the news channel I watched this morning, and there was a report out of New York that the e-bikes are blowing up because of the batteries. It's like they just, there's a pop and then it flames everywhere. It's those cheap Chinese batteries that they're using. They're dangerous. Repair shop for e-scooters caught fire in New York. I mean, over 100 calls because of it to the fire department. Those things are dangerous. I can't wait to find out when all these goddamn electric cars just start blowing up. Well, for no reason.
Another one recently in the UK where they talked about filling the sea with some sort of a chemical that was going to make the seaweed grow, and that would capture lots of carbon dioxide, extract it from the water and things. These ideas are, I'm not sure whether they're anything more than perhaps virtue signaling or just trying to get headlines, that kind of thing. I can't see that this is ever going to get off the ground.
Let's talk about Net Zero Watch, your organization, because I want to give people a sense of where you're actually coming from when in terms of your response here.
Okay, so Net Zero Watch has been around for a couple of years. We actually operated under a different name for a few years before that. We're a campaigning organisation based in London. We're here to ask all the questions about net zero that the mainstream media on the whole would rather people weren't asking. We've done a lot of work reviewing the calculations that the bureaucrats in London have put together. We have our Committee on Climate Change, which is essentially the government's official advisors on this subject. They said that, net zero is only going to cost 1 to 2% of GDP, and we went and we spent a couple of years trying to get the underlying calculations under freedom of information, and when we did, they were embarrassing. They were absolutely fake. I mean, the one that I particularly enjoyed was the fact that they said you could buy an electric vehicle for £11,000 now today. Now, if you go into a car dealership today, you won't get one for under 25, and it's that sort of nonsense that allowed them to come up with these very low estimates of the cost. I don't think anybody believes them anymore. There are some of the big accountancy firms have come up with estimates of the cost of net zero that are much higher now, and I think that people are beginning to realise that this isn't going to be cheap, and in fact it's going to be disastrously expensive. The interesting thing that I've started to do is to try to compare the cost to the cost of global warming, which there's a figures are banded around for what global warming will cost. What the release of a ton of carbon dioxide is supposed to cause. Well, I mean, in the US government's official estimate, I think it's around about $100 of damage. Now, we're spending twice that amount trying to decarbonize our electricity system already. It's costing £200 a ton of carbon dioxide already, and we're not even finished yet, and it's going to get harder. So it shows that what we're doing is fundamentally irrational, and there's some very interesting questions around why we are doing things that are demonstrably irrational.
So this is a perfect opportunity for us to talk about modeling. Your paper about the recent NASA modeling really caught my attention because it draws attention to, I guess, potential problems with models and just the fact that we have this inordinate level of confidence in models, which often can have very spurious variables in them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have just published a very short paper which reviews some of the underlying computer code from NASA's Model E climate model. And now I've been doing climate for the best part of 15 years now. And even I was shocked at how poor the modelling is. What the paper shows is that in certain areas of the climate system, they are unable to work out what is going wrong. They're getting answers that are daft, but they can't work out how to fix it. So one example is they keep getting cloud cover percentages, so the proportion of the sky that is covered in cloud, but the proportion goes negative, and they can't work out why. So all they do is they stick in a line of code that says if it goes negative, well, make it just a bit positive. But of course, clouds are the most important feedback in the climate system, so that will have huge knock-on effects on the predictions that come out of the climate model. So yeah, the climate modelling is extremely poor. And it's not, of course, it's not just climate modelling. You know, this is quite similar to things we saw in the pandemic, isn't it? At the start of the pandemic, I spent a lot of time tracking the predictions of deaths in the UK. We were meant to be getting tens of thousands of deaths, and that was why we all had to be locked up. But within 2 days of the predictions being issued, the actual number of deaths was already outside the uncertainty levels in the prediction. It's a general subject, I think, that politicians are much too inclined to believe what scientists tell them based on computer models. And scientists are kidding themselves that they can predict the future, and they really can't.
You know, you're just reminding me of something. I remember seeing a video clip of, I believe it was a UK scientist, in fact, a modeler who was, you know, speaking with an interviewer and didn't feel he had a particular amount of accountability for creating a model that dramatically overestimated the death toll. Okay, do you remember this?
Yeah, I imagine that would be Professor Ferguson who prepared the model that essentially led to the lockdown, because it said we were going to be having hundreds of thousands of deaths within a few months' time. And yeah, these people aren't accountable, because if the forecasts turn out to be completely wrong, well, that's good news, isn't it? The number of deaths wasn't nearly as bad as we thought they were. I mean, it's worse in many ways for people modelling things like pandemics, because of course they get found out fairly quickly. For climate modelers, they're making predictions about 50 years in the future or 100 years in the future, and so they're never going to be held to account for those predictions for when they go wrong. But the steps that we are proposing to take, as we've already said, I mean, if we're talking about trying to change the climate through geoengineering, these are potentially catastrophic. I mean, the things that would make the effects of lockdown look like a walk in the park. This is much, much more serious, but they are much less accountable.
We've seen a lot of movement towards, I mean, in the US, it's called the Green New Deal. I think in the UK, it might even be called the Green Deal as well. Essentially, a whole series of policies that have been already being implemented in different ways. You know, you have Germany, you know, shutting down all its nuclear reactors, which is, again, kind of is strange to me, given what I know about, you know, emissions and nuclear. But I guess the point is, I want to get a sense from you, you know, where we're at today, and what are the costs of the societal costs of the implementation of some of these policies? Because obviously this is your bread and butter, I guess.
Yeah. So the big picture of the policies is that we are planning to completely decarbonize the economy. So that means essentially electrify everything, get rid of fossil fuels, replace it with technologies based on electricity, and generate the electricity using, in the UK, essentially wind farms. Now, since those policies started to come on board, which was in the UK, it was about 2003, up until the eve of the Ukraine war, electricity prices had doubled. And the pain was starting to be felt by consumers and was starting to be felt by industry. I mean, essentially in that period, a huge amount of UK manufacturing had closed down. It had all gone to the Far East. And it was really only the very high value stuff that was left. Then we had the Ukraine war and energy prices went completely through the roof. And at that point, people started to feel the pain really quite badly. And, you know, we're looking at another winter.
Classrooms warns American children could be subject to Chinese propaganda in their own schools. That's under the pretense of cultural exchange. The report notes 143 school districts across the United States have engaged in contracts to establish Confucius Institutes in classrooms, including in 3 of the nation's top science and technology high schools, adding that several of them are located nearby 20 U.S. military bases. That's all to the tune of nearly $18 million of funding from 2009 through 2023. The group noted a pair of Chinese nationals who taught Mandarin in a Delaware school district during the 2012 to 2013 school year. They cited the district's webpage, which stated these teachers underwent a rigorous selection process in China, including interviews with Chinese state officials at the national level. The group warns this is part of the Chinese Communist Party's broader soft power strategy, aiming to influence policy in nations throughout the world. The group requests state and federal officials immediately investigate the scope of China's involvement, influence, and access to our K-12 student information and curriculum, adding families should also have full access to view how these cultural and language immersion programs are financed. A terrorism event. That's what the former U.S. counterintelligence chief says the U.S. is facing as it navigates ties with the Chinese Communist Party. In a congressional hearing Wednesday, he said it's naive to think the U.S. would be able to come to any kind of agreement with the Chinese regime on issues around critical and emerging technologies. NTD's Jeremy Sandberg has more on his testimony.
The hearing before the House Select Committee on the CCP was called Commanding Heights, Ensuring U.S. Leadership in the Critical and Emerging Technologies of the 21st Century. William Evanina, former director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, was one of 3 witnesses who testified.
I would offer to this committee that we are in a terrorism event.
He says the CCP is an existential and unparalleled threat to the U.S. The former counterintelligence chief says the CCP's economic war with the U.S. has manifested itself into a terrorism framework.
A slow, methodical, strategic, persistent, and enduring event which requires a degree of urgency of government and corporate action.
Evanina says the U.S. private sector has become the geopolitical battle space for China, as a lot of the CCP's non-conventional intel collection is performed amid business transactions and research activities. He was asked if it's fair to say there's no such thing as a truly private company in China.
And in my experience in the intelligence community in the last decade, I have not seen an example of a private company that is either not owned, operated, or influenced by the Communist Party of China.
Evanina recommended a new economic threat intelligence entity that would share real-time threat information with U.S. private companies to mitigate risks in doing business with China.
There has to be direct conversation with the CEOs and the boards of directors of those companies, so they're aware that China's coming for their technology.
Why were there no stars on the American flag?
According to the FBI, the annual cost of the CCP's intellectual property and trade secrets thefts amounts to $225 billion to $600 billion. That's equivalent to a lost wealth of about $4,000 to $6,000 after tax value per American family of 4. Jeremy Sandberg, NTD News.
As Russian and Chinese envoys set foot in North Korea for a rare visit, leader Kim Jong-un welcomed Russia's defense minister with an arms exhibition like no other. Photos shared by North Korean media Thursday showcase some highlights, including new drones and 2 banned ballistic missiles. Both warheads were test launched by North Korea this year. Let's take a closer look.
North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un showed Russia's defense minister the country's banned ballistic missiles at a defense exhibition as the neighbors pledged to boost ties. That's according to North Korean state media on Thursday. The Russian minister Sergei Shoigu and a Chinese delegation led by a Communist Party Politburo member arrived in North Korea this week. They're visiting for the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, celebrated in North Korea as Victory Day. The nuclear-capable missiles were banned under UN Security Council resolutions adopted with Russian and Chinese support. But they provided a striking backdrop for a show of solidarity by 3 countries united by their rivalry with the US. Shoigu is making the first visit by a Russian defense minister to North Korea since the fall of the Soviet Union. For North Korea, the arrival of the delegations marks its first major opening up to the world since the COVID-19 pandemic. North Korean media reported that Shoigu gave Kim a letter from Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kim said the visit had deepened what he called the strategic and traditional relations between North Korea and Russia. North Korean media said Kim expressed the belief that, quote, the Russian army and people would achieve big successes in the struggle for building a powerful country. Local media reports on KCNA did not refer to the war in Ukraine. But North Korea's defense minister, Kang Sun-nam, was reported as saying North Korea fully supported what he called Russia's battle for justice and to protect its sovereignty. North Korean media said Kim also met Chinese Communist Party Politburo member Li Hongzhon for talks.
Protests sparking in northern China starting last week. Angry parents demanded authorities give their children a fair chance at an education. NTD spoke to one of them on the scene. To protect his identity, we've distorted his voice.
I think there were about 400 people, or even more. I saw police officers in front of the state agency receiving protesters. There were about 100 of them.
These parents said they're angry about the unfair distribution of educational resources. According to them, over 40,000 students from nearby Henan province came to the area to take their high school exams. And because of it, these students pushed up the cutoff score for local high schools, making it harder for local kids to get accepted. Authorities arrested at least 10 people for alleged fraud and said they are investigating the education companies involved. After dedicating years to get a college diploma, a growing number of young adults in China are taking on the role of caregiver for their parents and diverting from their intended career paths to do it. Let's zoom in.
Full-time children. The phrase describes a so-called job that pays kids for taking care of their parents, where grown-up children stay at home. An expert gives his take on the situation.
The invention of the term full-time children is just another way of saying large numbers of young people are unemployed.
According to official data released this year, China's unemployment rate exceeds 21%. That means almost 2.5 million college students can't find a job in China. Though a professor at one of China's top institutes, Peking University, anticipates that the true figure is pushing 50%, double the number released by Beijing. According to a Chinese job hunting agency, 13.3% of recent graduates are now classified by the term. On a Chinese social media platform, over 4,000 users shared posts or comments discussing their experiences as full-time kids. Some claimed it to be a short-term phrase, while others suggest it could be a lifestyle choice.
Chinese society is undergoing distortion, and this includes the distortion of values.
Under Beijing's 3-year zero COVID-19 policy, strict lockdown measures interrupted economic activities on a mass scale. Many small to medium-sized businesses shut down. And with supply chains paused, many foreign companies operating in China started seeking greener pastures, shifting production to other nations. Now China's job market is wounded more severely than ever, and the country's youth are feeling the impacts.
A leading China critic is calling for a values-based economic alliance. That's to defend against Chinese aggression. It comes after a recent report highlighted how China is looking for an advantage in a global values struggle. NTD's Malcolm Hudson has the report.
Democracies have failed to stand up to China and have instead let go of their principles. That's according to Jianli Yang, founder and president of Citizen Power Initiatives for China. He says it's difficult to confront China on human rights issues and that democracies have been dropping their values for one main reason.
China has no moral authority. The only power it has is money. And its model, its money power actually is appealing everywhere in the world.
Yang is calling for the formation of a so-called values-based economic NATO to guard against China. Nations in this alliance would support each other economically if China tries to punish them for standing up for their values.
When one of the countries was attacked economically by China because of value-related conflict, other countries come to help.
For example, in 2020, Australia called for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. China responded to this by punishing Australia with steep trade tariffs, such as on wine. Coming to Australia's defense, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China launched a campaign urging people to buy Australian wine. Similar campaigns have emerged when China attempted to punish other nations, like Lithuania. But these campaigns are isolated. Yang says they should be a broad and united initiative.
So I think these models deserve to be institutionalized. That is why I advocate for a value-based economic NATO.
Yang says nations will find that economic relations with China will affect their national security, and he adds that with the possibility of China invading Taiwan, it's vitally important to have a values-based economic NATO already prepared and set up. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
To rebuild his life.
But the White House today got pressed on what seemed to be a change in narratives about President Biden's involvement in Hunter's business dealings. And President Biden has previously said that he had never talked to Hunter about his overseas business dealings. But on Monday, the White House press secretary used a slightly different wording.
The president was never in business with his son. I just don't have anything else to add.
And of course, never been in business versus never talked about it could mean two very different things. And that prompted House Republicans to say on Wednesday,
this rigorous oversight has certainly rattled the White House, who suddenly has shifted its public position surrounding Joe Biden's knowledge and involvement in Hunter Biden's foreign business dealings.
But a White House press secretary today defended her previous comments, though without giving a clear yes or no to questions about
which statement is true, or is this semantics and they're both true?
As I stated on Monday, when I was asked this question multiple times, nothing has changed.
But can you say specifically that the president did not have discussions of any kind with Hunter about his business dealings?
Nothing has changed. I don't have anything to add to what I stated on Monday.
And this new scrutiny over the White House's description of President Biden's involvement comes amid whistleblower allegations that President Biden
more cover up
Hunter's business partners
to protect
and that
Hunter Biden.
On Monday. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is facing heated questions. This from Republican lawmakers over his handling of the southern border. And how did Mayorkas respond? The Alabama senator holding up military appointments says he will not back down before Congress goes into a month-long recess. He also says no one from the Biden administration has contacted him to resolve the standoff. That have been suppressed or ignored. So, Melina, tell us, what did you learn from those witnesses today?
A lot to take in from these witnesses, but one important point is that even when they do encounter UAPs or UFOs, there's no acknowledgement or legitimate way to report them. That's even when they're so close and possibly endangered by these encounters, as described by one of the witnesses, Ryan Graves, who's a former Navy lieutenant. He described a case where an object was flying within 50 feet of the aircraft he was in.
Nothing tethering it to the ground. These sightings are not rare or isolated. They are routine. The stigma attached to UAP is real and powerful and challenges national security. It silences commercial pilots who fear professional repercussions.
And another witness, who's a former Pentagon intelligence officer who also worked on a UAP task force, says that the government has likely had knowledge of non-human activity since the 1930s.
Of a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program.
But like much of what we heard today, details of specific locations can't be publicly divulged.
Yet we don't have access to it, that someone else is profiting from it.
Weapons projects that are unsanctioned or that we don't have oversight of, I mean, that's problematic.
Honestly, I'm concerned that we're not utilizing this technology to the maximum extent possible.
And Grush says he wants to share more classified information with lawmakers in the SCIF, which is a location here in Congress where they can discuss classified information. But so far, they faced pushback against this effort.
Yeah, Melina, we know this is a bipartisan topic. You have concerns from both Democrats and Republicans who are trying to understand the extent and magnitude of the situation. Do you expect any legislation to come out of this?
Lawmakers say they're working on perhaps more whistleblower protection laws to encourage more witnesses like the ones here today to come forward with more information. Another congressman says that if they're denied the ability to continue this investigation, targeting the money could be successful.
There are things that Congress could do to defund salaries, agencies, and programs.
And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer introduced a bipartisan bill that would declassify UFO records, and he plans to introduce this as part of an amendment to the defense bill later this week. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
Melina, thank you for that. And joining us next to discuss the hearing is Gary Hesseltine. He served in the British Royal Air Force, followed by a 24-year career in law enforcement. Now Gary is Vice President of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. Gary Hesseltine, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Gary, there was a lot of anticipation leading up to this hearing, as you know, people have seen in the video clips, people waiting until overnight to get in. Like Congressman Burchett said at the top of the hearing, there were no little green men or flying saucers he was going to drag in there and unveil. But what do you think were some of the most important things to come out of this hearing?
I mean, bear in mind, obviously, within the UFO research community, I'm aware of many of these things and the allegations that have been put forward over many decades that have been suspected. But I thought that today's hearing was truly historic, not only for the UFO researchers, but principally for you guys, because I think that you have been deceived. And that the more you look into it, the more you will find. And as David Grush, one of the principal witnesses, said that he's willing to go into a SCIF, a safe, secure facility, and explain everything to any congressman or woman who wants to be there, who is authorized to hear what he has to say. But I mean, he said some pretty telling things. He'd interviewed 40 people over 4 years before he then put in the complaint to the Inspector General. The Inspector General heard his testimony in 11 and a half hours, as he quoted, of testimony. This guy is no ordinary guy. He's cleared up to presidential briefing level. So he really is the guy who kind of knows what's what. And if you heard what he said, he was asked some very direct questions. Do we have retrieved engineering, non-human technology? Yes. Do we have bodies? Yes, we have biologics, I think, as he described it. He was reluctant to say it was extraterrestrial exclusively because most researchers now think that with the quantum physics world, that the interdimensional aspect is a possibility for some. I still personally think that what we are dealing with largely is extraterrestrial, but even people will talk now of what's called intra or infraterrestrial, which is basically a long, silent civilization that's on the planet already that basically keeps itself to itself. But it could be a combination of all those things.
Well, Gary, you make a lot of really good points. One of them I just kind of want to highlight. I was actually at the hearing in person to watch it. And as you mentioned, the witnesses were extremely credible. That struck me in and of itself. And then you have a bipartisan group of lawmakers that were really engaged with them, asking serious questions, nobody mocking anything they said. And so, and it seemed like everybody wanted to know what was going on. But I do want to ask you, the Pentagon, coming under fire for covering up the issue of UFOs and extraterrestrials. If there is so much evidence out there, videos, people, testimony, Why do you think that the U.S. government would not want people to know?
It's a really complicated question to just give you a quick answer. I think a lot of it is that it would affect the status quo. I mean, if say, for example, a UFO really did crash in Roswell and it was alien, shall we say, and if you got your hands on that tech, what would you try to do? You would naturally try to reverse engineer it, because if you did, America would become the most powerful nation on the earth. If that was a success, we don't know, but that's the kind of story that we're talking about. And I think that if these reverse engineered programs that David Grush said unequivocally are there, and he's happy to talk about them in closed special session in SCIF, in secure facilities, he's happy to disclose that. He said, I know the places, I know the names, and he said many of the people who were first-hand involved in crashed retrieval, non-human intelligence material have actually now, after him, given testimony to the Inspector General. So I think that, in a sense, that's huge, because what it says is that there's, on the one hand, the Pentagon are basically saying, we don't want to really say too much. Now, that adds to the story of what has been always the story, which is the intelligence community, or the military-industrial complex, I would say, have controlled with these special access programs, these black programs that have been rumoured about, but now we have a first-hand witness. And he said something really important. He said people are still working, first-hand witnesses working on those reverse engineer non-human intelligence programs have given testimony to the Inspector General. So one of the things that I would hope that would come from further hearings is, let's get the Inspector General who heard that and say, what did you think of that, Inspector General?
Gary Heseltine, thank you so much for joining.
You're welcome, anytime.
Masculinized by Adam's apple more prominence, my fertility unknown. I look in the mirror sometimes and I feel like a monster.
4 witnesses testified at the hearing, among them Chloe Cole, who told her detransitioning story. She said that she started gender transition at the age of 12, but realized that it was all a lie at the age of 16. She talked about the physical and psychological pain she endured after the surgeries. She called gender-affirming care one of the biggest medical scandals in American history. The Biden administration issued what it described as the first ever hazard alert for people working in hot weather. Temperatures are expected to soar today and tomorrow across the East Coast. The administration made reference to what it called the climate crisis for its need to send out the alert. The White House notice says it reaffirms that workers have heat-related protections under federal law. The White House also said more than 400 workers have died from environmental heat exposure, while thousands more are hospitalized every year. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre yesterday described the heat wave as a difficult time and said President Biden was treating the climate with the urgency it requires. New York City imposed an excessive heat advisory today as a heat wave descended on the eastern United States. Here's Mayor Adams.
Our city is under excessive heat warning from today, Thursday, July 27th to Saturday, July 29th. The heat index will be 105 today and 105 to 108 tomorrow. The index will be slightly less on Saturday, but will meet heat advisory conditions.
National Weather Service says 180 million Americans are under heat watches and warnings. Temperatures and heat index values above 100 degrees are forecast until at least Saturday. Cooling centers have also been opened across New York City for those who do not have access to air conditioning. President Biden is set for talks with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni today. She's won praise from the U.S. administration for her strong backing of Ukraine as it tries to fend off Russia's invasion, and for her willingness to pull Italy out of some of the Chinese investments. White House officials said that in addition to discussing Ukraine and China, two leaders are expected to discuss immigration from North Africa to Europe. Before her White House meeting, Meloni headed to the Capitol to meet with Senator Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and other lawmakers. She's also scheduled to meet with Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Her visit comes as Italy prepares to take up the presidency next year of the Group of 7 industrialized nations. A congressional hearing on the effect of pandemic-era school closures. Democrats say closures were necessary. Republicans argue closing schools led to historic loss of progress and a number of social issues. Here are the highlights.
In only a matter of 2 years, a generation of progress was lost.
On Wednesday, a subcommittee from the House Education Committee held a hearing titled Generational Learning Loss: How Pandemic School Closures Hurt Students. In his opening remarks, the chairman said closures led to erased learning progress, citing the nation's Report Card's 2022 assessment.
Math scores are at their lowest point in 2 decades. The same for reading, history, and civic scores plummeted to their lowest mark since the tests were first administered in the 1990s.
He added that closures not only lead to learning loss, but also to social issues.
Adolescent mental health issues spiked, hospitals visits spiked, and sadly, so did suicides in certain regions of the country. It's a steep price to pay, and they're continuing to pay.
Democrats defended the closures, saying they were necessary to prevent potential harm.
If we would have kept schools open, more people would have died due to COVID.
Many Republican-led states pushed for schools to reopen early. States guided by Democrats tended to favor remote learning, as in most teachers' unions.
Yes, my colleagues and I are deeply concerned about missed learning, but I also urge us to keep in mind the lives lost as well as the lives saved by limiting exposure.
Data does not indicate that the virus spread more rapidly and more deaths occurred in states where schools reopened early. Numbers also show that few children died from the illness. Many who did also had other conditions. Republicans say lawmakers should investigate decisions made by schools during the pandemic. They also want to explore what happened to the $190 billion in federal money spent on education over the time period.
Hunter Biden's plea deal is on hold after a judge questions the agreement reached between the defense and the prosecution. She was surprised by the sweeping nature of the immunity that would have been granted to the president's son. To unpack this complex situation, I spoke with Will Scharf, former federal prosecutor and Republican Attorney General candidate for Missouri. Will Scharf, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you. Good morning.
Good morning. Will, you said Hunter Biden's attorneys were essentially trying to get him a, quote, slap on the wrist for his crimes. How so?
So if you look at the plea agreement and the pretrial diversion agreement that his lawyers in the Department of Justice tried to push through the court yesterday, basically in return for pleading guilty to 2 very minor misdemeanor tax charges, Hunter was being promised that he would not be prosecuted for a wide range of criminal activities, including his association with Burisma, including his association with basically a Chinese Communist Party associated private equity firm. All of these sort of international money laundering and influence peddling operations that he'd been engaged in, he was going to be given a free pass. Fortunately, though, that deal was blown up in court yesterday, and it looks like Hunter may still be held accountable.
And why is that? Why did this deal blow up?
So the judge basically looked at this deal and saw elements of subterfuge to the way that it was structured. Instead of a normal plea agreement with judicial oversight, the Department of Justice and Hunter's lawyers had essentially colluded to have what appeared to be a normal plea agreement, but then to have this other agreement, what's called a pretrial diversion agreement, operating in the background without judicial approval, and that's where they hid these provisions that would have guarded Hunter against being prosecuted for all of his criminal acts beyond the relatively minor tax charges that he was pleading guilty to. As a former federal prosecutor, I'll tell you that's highly irregular, if not unique. I've never seen it before. And the judge appears to have shared that view, that this was highly irregular and not the way that this case should have been proceeding.
Now, Will, IRS whistleblowers alleged recently that Hunter Biden received preferential treatment in this investigation. How do their testimonies factor into what we saw yesterday?
I think yesterday's events in court really prove what those IRS whistleblowers were saying. That instead of this case being treated as we were told like any other case, instead of Hunter, the son of the president, being treated like any other American, he was given a deal that, not just a sweetheart deal, but a deal that is so far beyond the realms of the normal that it almost strains credulity. Hunter was being allowed to walk free for over a decade of criminal malfeasance here and abroad with no prison time, with really just a slap on the wrist in the form of these misdemeanor pleas. That's not the way the system is supposed to work.
And just in closing, Will, all of this is so complex. As I'm listening to the news, I'm trying to understand what's happening. In layman's terms, why does it matter?
It matters because in the American system of government, the rule of law is supposed to apply equally to all citizens. It doesn't matter whether you're the son of the President of the United States of America or just an ordinary Joe off the street. The rule of law is supposed to be applied equally and fairly. And Hunter was getting a deal that no other American would get. And you have to believe it's because of who his father is and the political valence of this case. To my way of thinking, that's just wrong.
Will Scharf, former federal prosecutor and Republican Attorney General candidate for Missouri, thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Coming up,
speculated that Trump would be indicted today, which did not happen. And what's the extent of the Chinese Communist regime's role in fentanyl trafficking? The Drug Enforcement Administration laying out how the CCP uses false packaging to ship fentanyl chemicals to two major cartels. NTD's Melina Wisecup has the details.
Bipartisan collaboration between Republicans and Democrats is a rare sight here on Capitol Hill, but it does happen in specific areas like how to address the fentanyl crisis, which right now is the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 45.
Attacking the source of this, which is the Chinese chemical companies in China, but as well, we must deal with the hugeness of cartels and the persistence of cartels.
3 cases in which we charged 4 Chinese chemical companies, 8 Chinese nationals, and we charged them for knowingly providing customers in the United States and Mexico with precursor chemicals and the scientific know-how to make fentanyl.
The administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration testified that the Chinese Communist Party is engaging in deceitful measures, like false packaging to mail fentanyl precursors to Mexico, fueling 2 vast cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco cartel, which control the majority of the fentanyl global supply chain.
Border barriers, technology along the border, you have to stop their financial incentives.
This crisis costing more than 100,000 lives per year on average. That's roughly 300 deaths every day.
But if we're losing wartime numbers being killed by the cartels and the CCP, I ask you, what is the definition of war?
This deadly substance sourced in China goes to Mexico and then here to the U.S., where oftentimes social media platforms are the last step. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Wisecup, NTD News.
President Biden holding talks with the Italian Prime Minister today. China and Russia are at the top of the agenda. NTD's Iris Tao brings us more from the White House.
And President Biden today held bilateral talks with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. The two reaffirmed ties despite having ideological differences.
And I think Italian people, I want to thank them for supporting you and supporting Ukraine. It makes a big difference.
Meloni, who rose to power last year, leads Italy's most right-wing administration in decades. But the two leaders, though holding different stances on social issues like abortion, do share a lot of common ground on international objectives when it comes to China and Russia.
Regardless of their political colors, we know who our friends are in times that are tough.
Italy has been working closely with the U.S. to support Ukraine, and Meloni is reportedly trying to pull out of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which Italy's previous administration joined in 2019, despite opposition from NATO and Washington.
More and more countries around the world are seeing the risks and, quite frankly, the lack of reward for economic partnerships with China.
The White House this week again highlighted the risks of China's investment and infrastructure program, which critics say would expose countries' critical infrastructure and sensitive technologies to the Chinese communist regime. But the White House said ultimately,
For the Italians to speak to, I mean, that's their sovereign decision.
and now Washington and G7 countries are promoting their own alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The goal leaders say is to reduce dependencies on other countries. Reporting from the White House, Iris Howe, NTD News.
President Biden today announcing 2 steps to combat extreme heat and protect workers. This comes as nearly 40% of the United States population is facing heat advisories.
I've asked Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su to issue a heat hazard alert. It clarifies that workers have federal heat-related protections. We should be protecting workers from hazardous conditions, and we will. And those states where they do not, I'm going to be calling them out, where they refuse to protect these workers.
As part of the initiative, the Department of Labor will issue a hazard alert to notify employers and employees about ways to stay protected from extreme heat. The department will also scale up inspections in high-risk industries like construction and agriculture. The U.S. Forest Service will award $1 billion in grants to help cities plant trees to provide shade and help bring temperatures down. The Biden administration also plans to spend $7 million to develop more detailed weather predictions, plus $152 million to boost drinking water infrastructure and climate resilience in California, Colorado, and Washington State. 2 years after the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, lawmakers today investigating what went wrong. Military officials testifying before a House committee about what they witnessed. NTD's Arian Pazdar has highlights from the hearing.
Our hasty actions set the conditions for the Afghan government's collapse, the Taliban's slingshot to power, and the loss of 20 years of hope and progress in the Afghan people.
On Thursday, a House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee held a hearing titled A Failure to Plan, examining the Biden administration's preparation for the Afghanistan withdrawal. A retired Army colonel says most didn't approve of Biden's withdrawal when the U.S. left Afghanistan in August of 2021.
There is very little evidence to suggest that the Biden administration's plan would work, and a mountain range of evidence to suggest the plan would fail. General Milley, General Miller, and General McKenzie all recommended not withdrawing until the Doha Agreement conditions were met.
The Doha Agreement was brokered between the U.S. and the Taliban under the Trump administration. According to the Democrat ranking member, that's exactly when things in Afghanistan started to crumble. He says that's because after the agreement, Trump brought the numbers of troops down to only around 1,000, leaving them vulnerable to attacks from the Taliban.
My point here is there was a really, really hard decision that had to be made, that President Biden made, choosing from extremely difficult alternatives that would have potentially caused more conflict and more combat operations through 2021 into the present.
A major question people had after the failed withdrawal was who to hold accountable. Some say it wasn't clear who was in charge of the operation. Another retired colonel explained why he thinks that was.
You've got these different bureaucratic silos, so it could be DOD, state, aid, the IC with their different silos, and there's nobody in charge of this group on the ground.
He says the reason no one was in charge was because there was no formal plan for the withdrawal, and departments acted on their own. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
And should young children be permitted to permanently alter their bodies before becoming adults under the premise of gender-affirming care? This question was debated on Capitol Hill today. Detransitioner Chloe Cole testifying before lawmakers. An expert on UFO research shares with us why the flying objects often seen in the skies aren't being discussed and speculates about extraterrestrial life. He says much is being hidden from the general public.
Immigrants are coming through the border, and the number of border crimes and people that they are arresting and prosecuting for border crimes in the last few years is not only times by 10, it's times by 100. So in the past, maybe they had 5 to 6 criminals being, cases of border crimes. Now they're getting up to 500 a month. And this is in one very small county in one region of the border. So that's an example of what you're going to see, front row seat in this movie. But it gives an idea of what's going on a larger scale.
Wow, incredible. Now, this battle over the border, it continues to intensify in the courts, in Congress, and in so many small towns and even major cities across the nation. What would you say that this film adds to the conversation that is not there already?
Well, people are starting to see gotaways and people who are really seeking asylum coming into their hometowns all across the nation. What this film does is that it takes you there. There aren't any other films that really take you there, where you are riding in the car, you are seeing the arrests, and most shockingly, I've reported on the border, but this was one of the most shocking things for me, was that you are seeing regular Americans traveling from across this country going to the border to participate in human smuggling to make money. So it's not just the crimes of the cartels, it's not just the crimes of legislation and it's not just policy issues. We're also talking about Americans participating in that. And you see this in this movie, which you don't see anywhere else. And this is vital information that every American needs to know.
Absolutely vital. Thank you so much. Kay Rubicek, producer of the epic original Gotaways. Really appreciate it.